So tonight we're going to look at Bryan Langley's soil calculator. There's a lot to it, and hopefully I can make it a little bit easier to understand. And once you've used it 2 or 3 times, you can you get the hang of it. So let's just jump right in. The green squares have drop downs. So if you see someplace that's green, you use a pick list. So this section over on the right side of the screen, on the top page, is where the compost is figured and added and gives you output. So there are some built-in generic alpaca, buffalo, chicken, cow, horse, pig, rabbit, sheep, steer compost that were taken off a line, just a general compost. And if you add them, then how many cubic yards you can see pretty easily. Actually, let's do cow manure because that's more common. If you add 1 yard, and you have to click out of the box whenever you make a selection so that you see nothing over here has changed. As soon as you select something, all of the calculations in this spreadsheet calculate every calculation, and it will tell you a whole bunch of information. So in this particular compost, there in 1 yard, there's 2 pounds of magnesium, there's 5 pounds of calcium, there's 10 pounds of nitrogen, there's 5 pounds of phosphorus, there's 7 pounds of potassium, and then there's some micronutrients. And this is all in pounds per ton. And it'll give you down here at the bottom the average weight of the compost. Whenever you do a compost test, they'll always tell you as supplied and dried. They'll give you a weight per yard or so basically this is where you would, if you add your compost, you can see how it affects your soil before you ever do anything. And what I want to express is there's a lot of people that believe that you have to use, tons and tons and tons of compost in 1,000 square feet. So this is where you put how many square feet you're amending. 1 yard raises everything, 100 or so ppm. So 1 yard over 1,000 square feet is not even a half of an inch. But if you go and you decide that you want to put like 2 or 3 inches down, all of a sudden you're really changing your soil. And depending on what you pick, if it's something that's very hot, like Dwight, this is actually a compost test that Dwight sent me this year for, and it's not even really compost, it's manure because it's so hot. You can see it's like all of a sudden, if you use 6 yards, you've raised your calcium and potassium and phosphorus to and just extreme levels. So don't go crazy whenever you're using compost and manures. Use, less is more. Many times, less is more. So basically, whenever I go to do compost, I get this soil balanced, and then I add the compost at the end and see how it affects it. There are times whenever the soil test is very poor, and the results of the soil test, like if it's a very sandy soil, will be very, very low. And then you're like, well, I can't add tons and tons and tons of fertilizer, but I can go over here and I can add 2 yards of compost and it helps. So then, well, maybe I actually should add 4 yards of compost and start from there. That would be the only real time that I would start with compost. And I don't use these generic ones. If I'm going to use compost, I test it and I input the test, the actual, what you're adding. Because if you're not putting in what you're adding, there's not much sense in using this tool. It's going to tell you with fair certainty. I have tested and tested years after years, added what I wanted. So I'll have a soil test, I'll add what I want, I'll wait 3 months, and I'll test again. And what the calculator told me it was going to be in the end was very close to what it was in the end. So if you use real data, then you'll get real data out. If you don't use real data, then you're guessing, and it probably isn't going to work for you. So back to the pieces and parts. So that's where the compost is calculated, and this column right here is where everything gets added. Anything that you add gets added into this column and tells you how many parts per million you gain. Everything is calculated against the size up here at the top. So if you're calculating a big patch, then you put the right size in there. It'll tell you, you basically have to add more to get the same result. If you're breaking it down and adding like I add, where I add in 10 square foot pieces, so 100 square feet, as the plant grows, whenever I do mine, I will actually calculate to 100 square feet so that I don't have to do a whole lot of math whenever I'm getting ready to do those it's actually yeah, 10 by 10 by 10 squares, then I know exactly how much to add. So that's where you put what you're going to amend. This is where, whenever you add something, where it gets added, and it gets added to this section is where you put the soil results from the soil test. And then so you'll have your results that you have, and then when you start adding things, it'll go into this column, and then it'll add these two columns together and give you a representation of what you should have whenever you finish. This section right here is the CEC that we talked about last time, if people were here. This is actually a calculation, and it'll tell you, this is where I start. I start looking at what the CEC is, and I try to hit these ranges. I have the ranges that I like, but this particular cell right smack in the middle of the spreadsheet is a range that was put in, and there was a whole bunch of growers. I think it was the top 30 growers between 2003 and 2008, I believe is the time frame, that went together and talked to John Taberna at Western Labs, and he's a soil scientist. He's an actual agronomist, and he was interested in giant pumpkins and helping giant pumpkin growers. And he put together all of their tests and came up with the mean of all of their tests. And these were people that were very successful. And this is where he got these ideal ratios and these desired ranges that are on here as targets. That's just a target. It's something to shoot for. I'll tell you right now, you can never, or I have never, got every single ratio 100%, maybe once in 500 tests that I've done. There's always something that doesn't want to line up. So it's not important that you get exact numbers. It's important that across the board you get a good representation of all of them. This is where you input your pH. Some tests have buffers where they use a buffering solution, and it tells them how hard it is to change the pH. If your test doesn't have a buffer, you need to use a 9 here. the way that the calculator works, if you don't put a buffer here, if you leave it 0, it'll throw off your base saturation because it's a calculation. So that's one thing to remember is if you don't have a buffer on your test, use 9. This section is where your pH gets adjusted with lime, and this section is where your pH gets adjusted if it's too high and you want to add sulfur. So it's 2 different calculations, but it's all pH. And then down at the bottom, this is where you pick amendments. And you have to pick them, and there's a lot of them already in here. You pick one, and then you add how many pounds. So if we were to do 10, 10, 10, and we did 5 pounds, it would show us that the percentages of 10, 10, 10, and how many pounds per the 1,000 square feet is added of raw material. So this helps whenever somebody says from a lab where it gives you recommendations, they're giving you pounds of raw nutrient, and you have to figure it out. Well, now you don't have to figure it out. You can use anything that you want. I mean, the pick list is already there. That's great. But if you don't see it on the pick list, then what you can do is you can go to this second tab right here where it says fertilizer list, and you can add anything you want. All you have to do is type. You just put in, Cecil's special, whatever you want. Fert, right? And then you have what the analysis is. It's 3, 45, 12. And it's got some sulfur in it, some 2% sulfur, and it's got some calcium in it, 5% calcium, it's got some magnesium in it, and it's got some boron in it. These are all in percentages. And if you've got the label of what you're adding, then you can add what you want to add and anything that you can get. If it doesn't have to be on this list, it doesn't have to be what somebody says you need. You put it in and you put what it is, and then whenever you pick it, you go back out to the FERT calculator and you pull your pick down. Here's Cecil's special FERT, and it adds everything that I just added across there and calculates all of the calculations for you and adds it up here to the top how it's going to change your soil in parts per million. So it's an amazing tool to be able to do that and add anything that you can get, anything that you want to add. That's the fertilizer. It also has the second section is in the middle, is for lime products. And you'll see here, I've got, Kerry Gross had a special lime that he got, and I used this particular spreadsheet and added his lime. Sue Barber had some hydrated lime, and at one point in time, whenever I helped her do her soil test, I added it so I could do hers. The high ag was something that I've used, and the fast acting is something that I've used, and a lot of people in Circleville because it's available in Circleville. And then the third part is, here's your compost. The compost tests everyone I've seen will always show you in pounds per ton in this column. This is the column that you add here. It'll give you some parts per million down here, but that's not really what you're trying. You're not adding this column. You're adding the things that come up in this column, in this row. So this is Dwight's actual test, and if you see, you'll see that you don't need the ammonia nitrogen, you need the total nitrogen, which is right there. And then the phosphorus goes there, 48.7. The potassium was 30. 38.86. So, and as I went across, so the one thing about the calculator is the cells are locked. So I can't expand this. I put in 153.5 and the number was too big. So it does what Excel does and it doesn't represent the number. But if you click inside the cell up here at the top, it'll tell you what's in there, 153.5. And he has made whenever he made the spreadsheet, he made an alternate where if you highlight it, it'll show you the what's under the cell in a pop-up. So that kind of helps a little bit. And then on compost, a lot of times, I don't think this test did, it'll tell you how much is available each year. And if it does, if that's included in the analysis, then you add that in here. The amount of nitrogen available the first season, the amount of phosphorus available the first season, the amount of K the first season. These numbers are norms. If you don't have it, it's okay, just use that. So once you've added everything, there's no reason to go into the nutrient balancer or the converters. Those are the formulas, and you don't want to mess with those. These two tabs, the fertilizer tab and the FERT calculator tab, are the two you're going to do your work in. And basically, that's how the tool works. So we'll jump right into some actual tests. My second year of using the calculator, we grew the 1921, and I had I kind of, I jumped in full hog on it. This was my soil test before I added anything. So you can see that I had, my phosphorus was almost nil, and they're telling you it needs to be higher. My potassium was low, my calcium was a little high, my magnesium was really high, my sulfur was okay. I mean, it said the optimum is above 10. My micronutrients were in, kind of in the range that they said, and my cations were around 16, which it isn't a terrible. Between 15 and 20 is where I usually try to go. But if you'll notice, the cations here don't match those targets. So what the calculator does for you is if you get in there, and this is the exact same, so you can see that I've already just put them in there so that you guys don't have to watch me type. All of these numbers are what you put in. All right. So I always put the year that the soil test was and when it was in this. These have no bearing on any of the data, but it helps me remember. And my patch was 3,600 square feet. So the very first thing that I do whenever I am starting a soil test is I look at these base saturations of the CEC. And my target is on the high side in the calcium, at least 75 to 80. That's from experience, that's where I'm targeting. And then I want my potassium to be half of my magnesium, which if you look right here in this cell, the ideal ratio between magnesium and potassium is 2 to 1. So that would be where your magnesium was double what your potassium is. So that's where I first start looking, and my pH is low. So part of my CEC is hydrogen. So the very first thing that I do whenever I'm looking at a soil test is I look at this and I say, well, I need to raise the calcium, I need to raise the potassium, and I've got to raise my pH. I really like 6.8, 6.9 pH. The pH changes differently in different kinds of soil. In sandy soil, it changes much faster and much easier. In loam soil, it changes a little bit harder than sand, but easier than clay. And if you have a more clay-based soil, then it's harder to change. My soil type was a silty loam, so had a lot of clay in it. Silt is in between clay and loam, so I always tried to average 6.8 to 6.9 in between these two. So if this one was 6.7 and this was 6.9, I called it good. If this was 6.7 and this was 6.8, I'd raise it up a little bit if I could. So the first thing I do is I look and I say, I really don't want to add any magnesium. My magnesium's already way higher than what I want it to be, which I want it to be about in the middle. I want it to be about 15% of my CEC. So lime has magnesium. If you use general lime, which most people do, Dometic lime has between 11 and 12% magnesium. And if you add that to get enough to get your pH up, so let's say, I don't know, 30 pounds, and that raises, so go 50 pounds. So that raised my pH, we'll go 100 pounds. So this is how you do it. You just keep raising it until you get what you want, 125 pounds. And you look until you get what you want, 150 pounds. All right, so I'm getting close. 200 pounds. I got 6.9 in loam, 6.6 in clay, 250. And 275. All right, so now I'm about in my pH range that I want, but look what it did to my magnesium. My magnesium is way too high, so I can't use general lime. And I was like, okay, that's why I went and I got the fast acting and the high ag instead. I don't know why those aren't showing up. Fast acting one. Did I delete it? Oh, I messed up. Oh, it was in the oven. That's why. And that's the problem with using multiple screens at once. So, real quick, this is the one that I started using a long time ago because it was available. I can Control-C, copy it from this spreadsheet into the other spreadsheet under the fertilizer list. That simple. Go back to my FERT calculator, add the fast acting. Now I still got the same amount of pounds here, just change the fast acting, which was 4% lime instead of 12, and it went down 200 and something ppm, and it went down 6% on my CEC. Well, if I don't like that, then this high ag, which is what I actually used that year, I found this at a feed mill, only had 1% lime. So now this is much better. I only gained 16 parts per million on my magnesium, and I got my pH where I wanted it. So you can see how using different things and understanding what your targets are, how you can use the calculator to get where you want to get. Now, I've got actually the printout of what I actually used to grow the 1921, so I can show you. I just wanted to show you how that worked and how I go about. If that was a soil test I'd never seen before, that would be the first thing I did. Was I've got my calcium up to above 75%. I've got my pH where I want it, and I did it using lime. And I didn't change my magnesium because it was too high already. So in 2014, that year, I added 300 pounds of high ag is what I actually added. So I was close right there. And that got my clay soil at 6.9 and my loam side at 7.2. And the reason that I did that was because my soil always falls through the year. My pH will rebound back to its norm. So the norm before I added anything was 6.3. So as the year goes on, it's going to go backwards, and it's going to go, or I think it was 6.2. It's going to go backwards, yeah, right here, 6.2, to lower. So having it at 6.9, I felt like it was better, and actually I might have even been closer to 7 because I did have quite a bit of organic matter and organic materials. All right, so after I do that, the very next thing I look at is trying to get my potassium and my magnesium in line with each other. And right now they're at 14-1. This is the current ratios of everything. So my magnesium is 14 times higher than my potassium, and it needs to be 2. So I have to add potassium. I like, and this again is through experience and use and trial and error, I like sulfate of potash. The sulfates hang around longer. They're more time released. They don't have as high of a salt content, which we'll talk about salts in a few minutes. But I added 200 pounds of sulfate of potash. And again, I'm looking at my notes now instead of sitting here going back and forth and adding and adding and adding and adding until I get where I want. Now you'll see that brought my calcium down. All right. So everything you do is going to have cause and effect. So again, I'm still trying to get my calcium at 75%. That's what I really, really want, is at least 75%. So now that I've added that, the other thing that I look at is well, my phosphorus is really, really, really low. You need, you don't want it to be super high, but you need some. And I've found over the years that somewhere between 75 and 100 is the sweet spot. So I used that year, I used 50 pounds of bone meal, which also raises calcium. So I'm still raising my calcium, and I'm raising my phosphorus. So you got 15% phosphorus and 24% calcium. Now I use 50 pounds of that. That raises my phosphorus up a little bit. And then I've found, again, over the years, 6-24-24 was readily available. It is fairly cheap. It gives me a little boost in my nitrogen. It gives me a boost in my potassium, and it gives me a boost in my phosphorus. And it's because the percentages are higher. So 54% of the product is fertilizer. The rest of it is filler. Whenever you got 10-10-10, only 30% of the product is fertilizer and 70% of it's filler. And a lot of times those fillers aren't all that good. So I try to get something that has the higher numbers if I'm adding. So I like the 6-24-24. I added 75 pounds of that. Now, bam, my phosphorus is right there where I want it. My potassium went up. That's a little higher than I want it, but it's balanced with everything else. But my calcium is still too low. It's still not at 75%. So the next thing that I add that I think it's very good because of two things, and we'll talk about one of them in a few minutes. It adds your calcium and adds your sulfur, but it also removes, or it doesn't really remove it. It kind of ties up salts. So any extra salts that you have, having gypsum, and any calcium really, but gypsum helps reduce your salt index. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So I added 475. Now again, this is all to 3,600 square feet. So you look at those numbers, you think, my goodness, that's a lot of stuff. Well, if you divided that by 3 in 1,000 square feet, that's not that much. A lot of times people will figure everything in 1,000 square feet because typically, or even 900 square feet, which is what I'm doing. This is for 4 plants. They'll do it for one plant, and the numbers will be smaller. But I'm showing you for a large patch. I did the whole entire patch this way, and then I divided it again down so that I was applying it in 100 square foot sections. But I'm just showing you how this works. So now I've got my, oh, see now, I didn't click out of this cell of the quantity, and it didn't change my calcium. And you may have heard me pause because I was like, wait a minute, it didn't work. Well, it didn't work because I didn't click out of the cell. So once you click out of the cell, then it does all the calculations. Bam. My CEC now is 75%, which is right smack in the middle, where it's above the middle, but it's where I want it. The 16 is very close to the middle on my magnesium, and almost 8% is pretty close to the middle of this one, and it's half. So now my magnesium to K ratio is 2 to 1. Okay, so now the only thing left are nitrogen and micronutrients. Now, I don't test for nitrogen because in cold soils, I have found that the nitrogen, I don't believe the soil test. My plants are always high in nitrogen whenever I do tissue tests. But my soil tests always, I was paying extra to get a nitrogen test, sometimes $5 and $10 extra, and it wasn't giving me any information that was useful. Same thing with the sodium. After I tested, years and years and years and years, I saw no reason to pay the extra $2 to $5 for a sodium test because all my sodium was always low. And if your sodium's high and you're adding calcium, it's going to tie it up. And I'll show you that right now while we're talking about it. Let's say my sodium was 300. That's pretty high. But because I've got all this extra calcium in here, this section right over here in the top right will tell you if you have a salt index. What's your salt index? And if it's over 1, then the calculator will tell you how much gypsum you need to add. So real quick, let's just take these out and get rid of these numbers so that it's back to the soil. And if I had a 300 salt, my salt index is 1.6, and I need at least 148 pounds of gypsum in order to clear that. It ties it up and it gets rid of that salt index. Well, I added 475, but if we add exactly what it says, 148.6, so the calculation's telling you this is exactly what you got to do to get rid of that salt index. All of a sudden, your salt index is below 1, you're fine. All right. So okay, so now I'm back to where I was. So the next thing that I look at is nitrogen, and I usually go ahead and do my micronutrients is next because they're more important. Nitrogen doesn't add anything to anything but nitrogen, so it's pretty easy. The next thing I look at is my boron. The phosphorus to boron and the calcium to boron, I think, are probably just these three right here in a row are probably the most critical ratios to try to hit. But boron is super easy to get toxic. You really don't want, I try very hard not to ever get over 3.5. I've seen 6, but I don't like it. So if I'm doing it, I'm going to try to stay under 3.5. I add Mule 20 borax, which is out of the laundry soap aisle, and in this particular year, I added 4.75 pounds to 3,600 square feet, and it brings my calcium to boron right into the range here, but close to the top. I always want to be near 1,000, or maybe even sometimes a little over 1,000 to 1. And then my potassium to boron, I want to be very close to the 200 to 1. But I always go a little low because, and I'll show you why in a few minutes, because I always add something at the end that always bumps my potassium up a little bit. And I don't want to have to go back and change my borax. And again, this comes with doing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. And if you do them the same way, then you don't have to keep going back and changing stuff. So then the next thing is the manganese and or the zinc. It doesn't matter which one you pick. The worst one is copper because it's 10 times lower. But if you look over here, again, micronutrients are easy to get toxic. I try to keep my copper under 10 and my zinc under 5 or 6, and my manganese under 60 or so. I try not to get it nearly that high, but if sometimes it gets pretty high, and there is a point where if your phosphorus, and I'll show you a super high phosphorus soil test, you just can't hit these numbers. And what I mentioned the other night, what has to happen then is if your phosphorus is super high and you can't get these micronutrients dialed in, you have to add them through the year. You're just going to have to know that I'm going to have to add these micronutrients because your phosphorus is too high. You don't want to get into a toxic situation trying to make these numbers match because of something that's off. So that's one of the biggest cautions that I have to tell people all the time and make sure that they understand. Hitting these numbers is not the only thing you got to worry about. You got to worry about getting these numbers too big. I mean, I had a guy send me the test the other day, and his calcium's like 15,000, and his phosphorus is 500, and his potassium is like 800, and his magnesium is like 800, and his boron was like 6, and you know his manganese was 90, and his zinc was like 25. All of those are super, to the point where I've never seen a test that high. And I told him, you know, he even tested again because I thought that he had a bad test. And I told him, I'm like, I can't recommend adding anything. And you can't balance using the soil calculator without adding. And there was nothing to add. If he would have added anything, I think I would have been doing him a disservice by making his soil worse, by making those numbers higher. And I told him, I said, you know, I would consider either adding some more dirt and kind of like watering it down, or maybe even, you know, grow it in another spot for a few years. You can grow cover crops instead of the pumpkins, and then don't incorporate the cover back in. Let the cover crop pull the nutrients out, and then cut it off and throw it away. and try to pull out nitrogens that way. You can water the heck out of it. You know, a lot of times when it's that high, you can leach stuff away. But there's a point where I just tell people, you know, I don't feel comfortable telling you that we can make it balanced. We can hit these ratios, but these numbers are, you know, that's crazy numbers, and I don't want to do it. I don't want to be a part of messing up somebody's dirt. I always try when I'm helping somebody to look at it like, if this were mine, what would I seriously do? What would you really do? And I would not poison my soil to try to hit these numbers. I wouldn't do it. So that's the stance that I have to take whenever I'm trying to help somebody. I'm like, dude, I'm sorry, I wouldn't add anything. These are the things that I would try to do to reduce it. So back to what we're doing, manganese. There's two different manganese in this list, and sometimes they're harder to get. The one that I get from Alpha Chemicals is 32%. And if you look, whenever you pick it, it'll show you under the manganese column, this is 32% manganese. The other one is 24%. It's easier to get from like Amazon.com, or 27%, sorry. But it's also a lower number. And it's the same thing. I always try to go with the higher number if I can get it, because there's less fillers. And this year I used 7 pounds of manganese sulfate. I used 1.5 pounds of copper sulfate. So let's look and see what that did to the manganese. That put my manganese to phosphorus dead on. All right. It put my manganese to zinc, where my manganese is a little high, but that's okay because my zinc's low. So I'm going to add zinc in a minute. And my manganese to copper is really high, but again, my copper is really low. So I'm going to add copper in a minute. And my manganese to my iron is a little high. So this says the ratio it wants is 1 to 1.5 to 2.5. What I've found over the years is 1 to 1. So again, using the calculator and learning as you go, I prefer to have a 1 to 1 ratio here. So I just know that. I can't change it because the calculator's locked. But I know that I want this to be 1 to 1. So that's what I do. So I go and I put in the zinc sulfate, and that's all down at the bottom, and you get used to where they're at. And I added 2.5 pounds of zinc sulfate, and that brings my zinc a little bit low, but again, I'm going to add some stuff at the end that's going to raise that back up. And then I added 1.5 pounds of copper. And I used ironite this year in 2014. I've started using iron sulfate since then. It's easier to change, and it doesn't change other things. Ironite has a lot of other things in it, but I'm going to go with exactly how I grew the 1921. 25 pounds of ironite. And then we look over here and we look at the ratios. My zinc to copper is right on. My manganese to zinc is right on. My manganese to copper is right on. I'm still a little bit low on my K to boron, and I'm still a little bit high. Well, it's close, 1.3 to 1. But these other ratios up here, your cal to magnesium, that's because my magnesium really is still a little too high, but I'm starting to get into that range where I didn't really feel comfortable. I don't really like to be above 3,000 ppm, but in order to get there, I was okay with it this year. This, again, was a year that I had used the calculator one time and was successful, and I felt like if I added a little bit more, but don't go crazy, maybe it would be better, and that's what happened. I got my calcium to K ratio at 10, and I got my calcium to phosphorus level in between 40 to 100. Now, I'll tell you, almost every soil test that I do, these numbers right here don't come out because the phosphorus is too high. If you can get them there, great. If you can't, it's not the end of the world. So the last things that I always add, these I add because I believe that they help me grow. I always add 50 pounds of alfalfa meal per 1,000. So this is for 3,000. So it's 150 pounds of alfalfa meal. I always add 25 pounds of kelp, but this year I decided that per 1,000. This year I decided I was going to double up on that because I really like the kelp meal. So I went ahead and added 150 pounds of kelp. All right. I always add 10 pounds to 15 pounds of blood meal per 1,000. And this year I decided to go a little hotter and I went 50 pounds for 3,600 square feet. I always add fish meal and for 50 pounds. And that was a little hot. I normally go 7 pounds per 1,000 to 10. And I was doing, I doubled up and even a little bit more. I wanted my nitrogen to be a little higher this year. I added chickadee doo-doo, is a pelletized poultry mix that I had used the prior year and I really liked it. And I used feather meal. So all these last ones I always add as slow release, natural nitrogens. And this I did 18.75. I don't know how in the heck I came up with. I don't know why I didn't do 19, but that's what I used. Or even 20. So what I ended up adding in nitrogen was 72 parts per million. I try to hit between 50, usually about 50 now, but between 50 and 75 was my target back then that I wanted to see in my nitrogen. So then if you go back over here and look, all of those things have a little bit, like the kelp meal has a little bit of phosphorus, a little bit of K, a little bit of sulfur, a little bit, and so those change some of those other ratios a little bit. So that's why I always wait until I add those before I go back and look at this and say, is this good enough? So that dropped my phosphorus a little bit. My zinc is close. It was close enough. My manganese was close enough. My copper was close enough. These three right here were dead on. This is close enough because I really don't want to add any more potassium. I'm about 50 to 60 parts per million higher than I really want to be. So I really don't want to add any more potassium. And I don't want to change the boron ratio because then I'd have to add more calcium. So this was the end result of what I decided I was going to go with in 2014, and we ended up growing the 1921 from. So now the next thing I'm going to show you real quick is a sandy soil sample. This is one that I got recently, and I helped this guy, and I've done, there's a lot of times, especially out on the West Coast, that I'll get somebody that has a sandy soil sample. And the best way is to get a compost test. So he's going to do a compost test and send me his compost. But by adding 3 yards of cow manure, I made his numbers more manageable and easier to manipulate. His pH is super low. So, and his magnesium is super low. So we can use general lime. And the same thing I always tell everybody, if you can't get what, I always tell you what your nutrient is. I'm like, I use 21% calcium, 11.4% magnesium, and the calcium carbonate exchange as at 95%. If you get a lime and you tell me what those are, I'll add it to the list and change it so that we know exactly what it's going to, be whenever you use it. But because his soil is sandy, then you don't have to use nearly as much lime as I did with the clay, and it got it to 6.9 just with 45 pounds. And then we added 200 pounds of pelletized gypsum to get the calcium, because right now calcium's still low. So you see I'm still using the same process. I always go for the calcium first, and I use it, and I sit there and I go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth until I get it above 77 or 75. And I always go a little high because I know whenever I add these other things, then it's going to drop it, because it's that thing, where the CEC can only hold so much. Whenever you raise one, the others go down. So then I told him, he needs to, I really like the potassium to be above 300. I don't like it to be above 600. So that's my range from personal experience and testing and results that I do. Whenever I help somebody and this is what I try, and they tell me at the end of the year, I beat my personal best by 300 pounds, that tells me that I think I'm hitting the mark. And the more times that I hear that, the easier it is for me to make these recommendations. When I first started doing this, I was very tentative at telling somebody, I think you should do this. But I always took it from the view, if this were mine, this is what I would do. And it's up to you whether you do it. All right. So I added his potassium, got it near 400, 375. And then that brought his magnesium to calcium, or magnesium to potassium level at 2.1. His calcium is near 75. I mean, it's 0.2 off. So all of those ratios add up. Got the pH where we want it. So now I want to get the borax. I want to get the boron right. And so I added 0.6 pounds of borax. And that drops, that brings his potassium to boron right there where I want it, and his calcium to boron right there near the top. And then I look at his micronutrients. And I'm looking at his phosphorus is a little bit high. What did I add phosphorus? Oh, the cow manure. So whenever he gets his real compost test, we might not do 3 yards. We might do 2. And we might not add these things. So whenever he sends me the actual compost test, then we'll give, I was giving him, this is basically what you're going to have to add. But what I really want you to do is get your compost tested and tell me what it is in it. And then we'll go from there. So manganese is 3 pounds. I get all my sulfate micronutrients from alphachemicals.com. They have really good chemicals. They're cheap, and their shipping is reasonable, and they have everything. They have everything that you could possibly want all at once. The more you buy, the cheaper it is. So I usually get 4 or 5 people to go together and buy, 20 pounds of something and then split it up rather than buying 2 or 3 pounds a piece because that costs more. And the shipping is flat rate. So the more people that you can get together, the cheaper it gets. Copper sulfate is 0.6. So then you look over here and the manganese is a little bit off and the copper is a little bit off, and the zinc is going to be, the zinc is way, let's see, the zinc is already too high to worry about. I don't like it to be over 5 or 6. So the cow manure took me over 5 or 6. And the manganese is at 30. So I really kind of don't want that to be any higher. The copper is okay. I could add a little bit more. I'm not sure where I stopped there, but let me finish this. So then I add the alfalfa meal. Again, I always do this. I believe these really, really do help grow. They give you growth hormones. They give you bio diversity, and I believe that you need these things, so I always recommend them at those amounts. So now my zinc is dead on, my manganese is dead on, my copper is dead on, my zinc to copper ratio. This is one of those that it rarely lines up. It's very touchy. It don't take much to throw it out. The manganese to zinc. The zinc ratio is really, really hard to hit, but it's close enough. The boron is 204. Calcium is good. If I really, 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 really wanted to tweak it, I mean, it gets a little crazy whenever you're doing 0.01 and then you have to try to measure that, So it's like at some point, getting the number identical is just a little bit ridiculous. I mean, how are you're gonna have to break this out into tablespoons in order to get it 0.15 so that this number is 200. I mean, why is a tablespoon over 1,000 square feet really going to matter? It's not. So don't get too ridiculous. So that's a sandy one and how it balanced out. And now I've got one that was super, super, super high. The phosphorus is 600 before you add anything. There's no way, I can tell you right now, looking at this, there's no way the micronutrients are going to balance out. Just going to have to add micronutrients. This boron is already approaching where I wouldn't want to add any more anyway. His manganese is right there. His iron is good. His zinc is way too high. I mean, that's like toxic. So I always say, well, first thing is I wouldn't add any more things that have phosphorus and zinc. I just wouldn't. And his pH is really high too. So that makes me suspect that possibly he added a lot of manure based off of these numbers, and his pH is high and these numbers are high. I think he's got some hot manure in there. And I would suggest, if I'm looking at a soil test like this, rather than going with these numbers, I would suggest that you, and he's got 7.6 OM, I would suggest that you wait 3 months and test again. The raw manure will start to break down, and those nutrients will wash away with rain and snow and all that, and it'll be more of a realistic numbers. But I wanted to show you this and what I would do if the tests came back and he tested it 3 times and they all were similar. and he really wanted to go and he really wanted to balance his soil out, I would tell him, well, this is if you want to go with these numbers, this is what I would do. But I wouldn't necessarily suggest that you do that. And this is another one, because his calcium is so high. If he had tested for salts and they were, what I said earlier was 300 was high, or actually, I say 200. 200 is high. He doesn't even have a SAR because his calcium is already too high. So he has to have 300 in salts before he even has to add a single pound of gypsum to compensate. So having high calcium helps with your sodium index. So I would look at this and I would say, well, his calcium's already high enough. Don't need to worry about that. His magnesium is already high enough. Don't need to worry about that. His potassium, in comparison to everything else, it's got enough. But it's 4-to-1 on his magnesium. And like I said, I'll go between 300 and 600. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm not going to need to add any lime or magnesium, but I do want to add sulfate of potash. Now, if you want, right here is the muriate of potash. So you can use that, and it'll work just fine. So I'm probably going to add 25 pounds. And that's going to bring his magnesium to potassium ratio to 3.1, and he's approaching that 600 parts per million, and I really kind of don't want to go over. So let's do 30. And that brought him down to 2.1. Then what I'll do is I'll back it down and see where does it fall so that it just hits 2-to-1. 28, 27. All right, so 28 pounds. So 28 pounds is good enough. That gives him his 2-to-1 ratio. That keeps him under 600. And basically, his calcium to K ratio is good. His calcium to magnesium ratio isn't terrible. But because his potassium is so high, his calcium to potassium is terrible. And that's going to affect how his plant takes up calcium. So he may have to do some kind of calcium addition through the year. But I wouldn't do that unless a tissue test warranted it. And then the next thing I look at, I'm looking and I'm like, well, can't add any zinc. That'd be ridiculous. Don't really need to add any manganese, although his ratio is off, but you're never going to line it up. And this manganese index over here needs to be above 12. So over here in the pink on the right-hand side, it figures out what your manganese index is based off of your pH. And by adding 20 pounds of sulfur, it changed his pH from 7.5, actually 15 pounds of sulfur, to 6.9 in loam, 6.8 in sand, and he told me his soil was kind of clay, which is why it's holding on to all these nutrients. 7 in clay, so then I'd go like 16, because again, it's going to rebound. 17. It's going to rebound towards the high side. So now I'm in between 6.8 and 6.9. And you can see the CEC is at 21, so you know he's got a lot of clay in his soil or this organic matter. And so then the only micronutrient that I'm going to adjust in this is going to be the copper. But I'm not going to add a lot because I don't like it to be over 9. And I just made it over 14, so 8.6. But you see that it brought it from 200 something to 1 to 77 to 1, which is better. anytime that you can make it better without getting in a toxic situation, there's no reason not to. And then the boron, try to dial in that a little bit, not go over 3.5. Is going to be 1. It's too much. 0.5. Too much. 0.25. Too much. 0.2. Getting close. And then add the alfalfa meal. Kelp meal. And the reason I go with 25 is the recommended from way back whenever I first started was 6 or 7 pounds per 1,000. I use 25 because it was kind of expensive, and I did 2 plants, and it worked well. I use 50 now per plant. I don't think you can use too much kelp meal, but it is expensive. It's 75 bucks a bag. And if you get it, if you get a deal, OVGPG usually has it for around $45 or $50 a bag. But I hate telling people to spend $100 on something and they have to pay shipping because most places won't carry it. So you got $75, $80 for the material and another 80 bucks to ship it because it's a 50-pound bag. It's not that important. But if you can swing it and you're doing more than one plant, part of a bag is better than none of a bag. And so that gives me pretty much, my calcium's a little bit high to boron, but I'm at 3 on my boron, and that's really kind of where I don't want to go. I mean, I will go to 3.5, but I'd rather be around 3. So that would be what I do to one that was super, super high. So we've been here an hour now. I'm going to go ahead and stop here and let everybody ask some questions. And I'll try to field some questions.